My husband abandoned me exactly one day before our daughter was due to be born, just so he could go on a luxury vacation with his parents. You will be fine, he told me while zipping up his suitcase. Just take a taxi to the hospital. The tickets are non-refundable. I stayed completely silent, watching the man I loved walk out the door. The next morning he called me in an absolute panic. "Jamila, what is going on?" His voice cracked over the phone. I replied coldly, "That is the price you pay." Then I hung up. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family that underestimated your worth. The harsh, abrasive sound of a suitcase zipper closing cut through the heavy silence of our master bedroom. It was a sound I will never forget as long as I live. I was 39 weeks pregnant, bent over the edge of our heavy mahogany dresser, gripping the polished wood so hard my knuckles turned completely white. A massive contraction was ripping through my abdomen, radiating down my lower back in relentless waves of agonizing pain. I could barely breathe, let alone stand up straight. And right there, less than 5 feet away from me, stood DeAndre, my husband of 3 years. He was not rubbing my back to comfort me. He was not timing my contractions on his phone. He was not calling the doctor or rushing to pack my hospital bag. Instead, DeAndre was meticulously folding his designer silk shirts and placing them carefully into his expensive leather carry-on bag. He smoothed out a non-existent wrinkle on a vibrant floral print shirt, humming a cheerful tune under his breath, as if we were just having a casual, relaxing Sunday morning. He looked completely unbothered by the fact that his wife was currently trying to breathe through what felt like her entire body splitting in half. The physical agony of the contraction was blinding, but the emotional pain of watching him prioritize his wardrobe over our unborn child was infinitely worse. He carefully packed his tailored swim trunks, his premium leather loafers, and his expensive cologne. He was getting ready for a luxury vacation to the Caribbean, leaving me behind to deliver our first child entirely alone. "DeAndre, please," I gasped, forcing the desperate words out through my tightly clenched teeth. "I really think it is happening. The baby is coming today." DeAndre paused his packing, but only long enough to admire his own reflection in the full-length mirror standing in the corner of the room. He adjusted the collar of his pristine polo shirt and checked his expensive luxury watch. "Jamila, you are just experiencing those false practice contractions again. We talked about this yesterday. The doctor clearly said your actual due date is tomorrow. You still have plenty of time before anything serious happens." "I am telling you, this is entirely different," I managed to say, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead as my knees threatened to buckle beneath me. "You cannot leave me right now. You absolutely cannot get on that airplane today." He finally turned to look at me, and the expression on his handsome face was one of mild annoyance rather than genuine concern. "Jamila, I have already explained the situation to you multiple times. The flight to St. Bart's leaves in exactly 3 hours. These first-class tickets are completely non-refundable. My parents have been planning this luxury anniversary trip for an entire year, and they are counting on me to be there to celebrate with them. I cannot just cancel everything because you are feeling a little discomfort. You will be fine. Just take a taxi to the hospital if things get serious later." Millions of women give birth every single day without making a huge dramatic production out of it. Before I could even attempt to process the sheer cruelty of his dismissive words, his phone began to ring loudly. The bright, cheerful chime of a video call echoed off the walls of the room. DeAndre eagerly swiped the screen, answering the call immediately. It was Vivian, his mother. Through the screen, I could clearly see her sitting in the plush leather seating of the airport premium lounge, a crystal flute filled with a mimosa resting comfortably in her perfectly manicured hand. Her signature diamond tennis bracelet caught the lounge lighting as she waved enthusiastically at the camera. "DeAndre, my beautiful boy," she cooed, her voice dripping with that artificial southern sweetness she always used when she wanted to perform for an audience. Tell me you are on your way to the airport right now. Your father and I are simply dying to board the plane and get to the island resort. I am just zipping up my bag right now, Mom, DeAndre replied, his voice instantly shifting into the eager to please tone he always automatically used whenever he spoke with her. Jamila is just being a little difficult about me leaving. Vivian rolled her eyes dramatically, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh that I could hear perfectly clearly across the room. She took a delicate sip of her morning mimosa before leaning closer to the camera lens. Do not let her use that pregnancy to trap you here, DeAndre. You know exactly how she gets when she wants attention. She spoke as if I were not standing right there in the room, enduring another crushing wave of pain. Vivian looked past DeAndre directly into the camera, meeting my eyes. Jamila, darling, you need to calm down. The women in the Pierce family deliver babies just fine. We are strong, capable women who do not need to be coddled. Do not bring that needy Southside mentality into our family. We expect a certain level of decorum and independence. Your father-in-law is sitting right here reading his financial newspaper and he agrees completely. You need to pull yourself together and let my son enjoy this vacation. Her words felt like a physical slap across the face, but they were entirely consistent with how she had treated me from the very beginning of my relationship with her son. Vivian and Reginald Pierce belonged to the affluent Black society of Atlanta. They constantly paraded around as old money dripping in designer brands, driving imported luxury cars, and boasting loudly about their prestigious real estate firm and their elite country club memberships. They had always looked down on me because I was born and raised on the South Side. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood they actively avoided. I built my entire life from the ground up, relying on my own intelligence and relentless hard work to secure academic scholarships and eventually build my highly successful career. I was a senior cybersecurity and digital forensics expert. I spent my days analyzing complex code, encrypting sensitive data, and building secure networks for major corporate clients. I started my business in a tiny, cramped dormitory room, typing lines of code until my fingers literally bled. I pitched my ideas to venture capitalists who initially dismissed me because I was a young Black woman from a rough neighborhood. But I proved them all wrong. I built an empire that secured financial networks for international banks. To the Pierce family, however, I was just a lowly technical support girl who spent way too much time staring at computer screens. They had absolutely no idea that I actually owned the cybersecurity firm I worked for, or that my private company was currently in the middle of a massive merger negotiation worth tens of millions of dollars. I had always kept my personal finances completely private because I desperately wanted a marriage based on genuine love and trust, not on monetary wealth. I wanted DeAndre to love me for who I was, not for my bank account. DeAndre happily agreed with his mother, nodding along enthusiastically as he grabbed his expensive sunglasses from the nightstand. You hear that, Jamila, he said. Mom is absolutely right. You need to be strong. I will video call you from the beautiful beach once we get settled at the island resort. We rented a massive private villa with an infinity pool and a personal chef. It is going to be incredible. The severe contraction finally peaked and began to slowly recede, leaving me gasping for air and trembling heavily with physical exhaustion. I stood up straight, pushing myself away from the heavy wooden dresser. I looked directly at DeAndre. I looked at the man I had solemnly vowed to spend the rest of my life with, the man who was supposed to protect me and be a loving father to the child growing inside me. In that singular defining moment, the blinding veil of romantic love fell away entirely. I saw him for exactly what he truly was. A selfish, arrogant coward who would always prioritize his family status and his own personal comfort over my health and well-being. I leveled my gaze at him, my voice completely devoid of the panic and desperation I had felt just moments before. DeAndre, I said, speaking slowly and deliberately so he would understand every single syllable. If you pick up that suitcase and walk out of that door today, do not expect to come back. This is it. You either stay here right now and be a father to your daughter, or you leave and you lose us forever. I will not tolerate this level of blatant disrespect anymore. I will not allow my daughter to be raised in an environment where her mother is constantly demeaned and abandoned. You have a choice to make right now. DeAndre stopped halfway to the bedroom door. He looked back at me, and for a fleeting second, I thought maybe my serious words had reached whatever small shred of humanity resided in his heart. But then his lips curled into a familiar condescending smirk. He actually laughed out loud. "Stop being so incredibly dramatic, Jamila," he scoffed, shaking his head side to side as if I were a foolish child throwing a ridiculous tantrum over a broken toy. "You are entirely too emotional right now because of the pregnancy hormones messing with your head. You are not going anywhere, and you are certainly not leaving me. You need me too much. Who else is going to give you a beautiful life like this?" He gestured broadly around the expensive master bedroom, completely oblivious to the fact that I paid the massive mortgage every single month without his help. He grabbed the extended handle of his rolling suitcase, stepped forward, and pressed a quick dismissive kiss against my sweaty forehead. "I will see you in a week, honey," he whispered confidently. "Try to relax and get some rest." And just like that, he turned his back on me, walked out of the bedroom, and headed down the wide hardwood staircase. A minute later, I heard the heavy oak front door slam shut, followed by the distant rumble of his car engine, starting and driving away down the street. I stood perfectly still in the empty room, the silence pressing in heavily around me. I was completely alone in the large, empty house. My husband had actually left me to give birth entirely by myself. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, cleansing breath to steady my racing heart. I needed to focus on reality. I needed to get to the hospital safely for the sake of my baby. The hospital was a 20-minute drive away, and I knew I could not safely operate a vehicle in my current condition. I reached over to the bedside table and grabbed my cell phone to order a premium ride service to take me directly to the emergency room. My fingers were trembling slightly as I unlocked the digital screen. Before I could even open the transportation application, a priority notification dropped down from the top of my phone screen. It was an automated alert from my banking application. I stared at the bright white letters on the glowing display and felt the blood run completely cold in my veins. The alert read Joint Savings Account Outbound Wire Transfer negative $45,000. Current available balance $0. I forgot how to breathe. I tapped the screen notification, forcing the banking application to open fully. There it was in plain, indisputable text. DeAndre had initiated an emergency wire transfer just 30 minutes ago, completely draining the entire joint savings account we shared. That specific account contained the money I had personally deposited, the money I had set aside specifically to cover my upcoming maternity leave expenses, and the hospital upgrade fees for a private, comfortable birthing suite. He took the money I had saved to pay for the professional postpartum night nurse I planned to hire to help me recover. I remembered vividly telling him just yesterday that those funds were strictly reserved for the baby. He took it anyway. He had stolen my hard-earned money to fully fund his parents' lavish luxury vacation to St. Bart's. He took every single penny to pay for the first-class plane tickets, the expensive resort suites, and the lavish dinners just to pretend he was a wealthy, successful son. He wanted to maintain the grand illusion of his family wealth using the money I had literally bled for. A new, much sharper pain tore through my lower stomach as my water suddenly broke, splashing loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. I looked down at the puddle pooling around my feet, and a cold, calculated rage completely replaced my sorrow. I realized in that exact moment that I was not just going to survive this betrayal. I was going to systematically dismantle the fake empire his family cherished so deeply. I knew exactly how to track digital footprints. I knew how to follow every single transaction down to the very last cent. DeAndre thought he could simply steal from me and fly off to a tropical paradise without any repercussions. He severely underestimated the woman he married. He assumed my silence over the past 3 years was a sign of weakness, when in reality it was simply observation. I had watched his family operation, I had seen the cracks in their polished facade. I knew exactly where they hid their financial secrets because Preston, his arrogant brother-in-law, had unknowingly bragged about their corporate tax loopholes during our Thanksgiving dinner. They thought I was completely clueless. They thought I was just a quiet girl from a poor neighborhood who should be eternally grateful to be associated with the prestigious Pierce name. The war had just begun. The ride to Atlanta General Hospital was an agonizing blur of brake lights and endless traffic. I sat in the back of an Uber, clutching the door handle with every bump in the road sending fresh shockwaves of pain through my lower back. My driver, a kind older man named Marcus, kept looking at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes wide with concern as he expertly navigated through the busy streets. He asked if I wanted him to run the red lights, but I just shook my head, unable to form a complete sentence through the crushing weight of the contractions. I focused entirely on breathing, pulling the cool air into my lungs, and trying to ignore the terrifying reality that I was doing this completely alone. My husband was currently sitting in a first-class seat sipping expensive champagne while I was sweating in the back of a hybrid sedan, praying I would make it to the emergency room in time. When we finally pulled up to the hospital entrance, Marcus literally jumped out of the car to flag down a nurse with a wheelchair. They rushed me through the sliding glass doors into the bright, sterile chaos of the maternity triage ward. Nurses moved efficiently around me, attaching monitors to my swollen belly and asking rapid-fire questions about my medical history. The sharp, rhythmic beeping of the fetal heart monitor filled the small triage bay. A doctor with a serious expression examined the readouts and gently explained that my blood pressure was spiking dangerously high. The baby was showing signs of distress and my labor had stalled. They could not wait for a natural delivery anymore. They needed to prep me for an emergency C-section immediately. As the nurses began setting up an intravenous line in my arm, a woman from the hospital billing department stepped into the room holding a digital tablet. She offered a polite, sympathetic smile, explaining that she needed to process the payment for the private luxury maternity suite I had reserved months ago. I reached into my overnight bag with trembling fingers and handed her my premium personal credit card. She swiped the card through the reader attached to her tablet. A harsh beep echoed in the room. The woman frowned slightly, tapping the screen. She tried it a second time. Declined. She looked up at me with an awkward, apologetic expression, stating that the bank was refusing the charge due to insufficient available credit. I felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up my neck. I handed her a second card, a backup account I kept for emergencies. She swiped it. Declined again. The billing representative cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably on her feet. She quietly explained that without the deposit, they would have to cancel the private suite and place me in the standard shared recovery ward after the surgery. I just stared at the ceiling, keeping my voice perfectly level, and told her the standard ward would be absolutely fine. The woman hurried out of the room, clearly eager to escape the awkward interaction. A younger nurse standing nearby gave me a look of profound pity, assuming I was just another struggling mother who could not afford her medical bills. But I was not struggling, and I was certainly not going to cry. Tears were a useless currency in my world. As soon as the nurse stepped out to gather surgical supplies, leaving me alone in the prep room for a few precious minutes, I reached back into my overnight bag. I bypassed the baby clothes and the receiving blankets, pulling out my heavy matte black laptop. I balanced the computer carefully on my lap, ignoring the IV line pulling at the back of my hand and the dull ache in my spine. I am a top-tier cybersecurity and digital forensics expert. I spend my life building impenetrable fortresses for international banks and dismantling the digital footprints of sophisticated corporate criminals. My husband clearly forgot who he married. He thought a simple password change on a banking app would keep me out. He was a real estate salesman with a fragile ego playing a dangerous game with a woman who wrote the security protocols his entire industry relied on. I booted up the laptop and connected to my private encrypted server. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard consumer banking portals and tunneling directly into the raw data logs of my financial accounts. I did not just want to see the balances. I wanted to follow the exact trajectory of every single digital coin. I quickly found the $45,000 he had drained from our joint savings. He had wired it directly to a luxury travel concierge in St. Bart's, covering the private villa and the first-class flights for himself and his parents. But $45,000 was not enough to max out my personal premium credit lines. Something else was severely wrong. I ran a deep diagnostic trace on my Social Security number, scanning for recent credit inquiries. A massive spike appeared on the screen. A brand new line of credit had been opened in my name less than 48 hours ago. The balance was exactly $100,000. My eyes narrowed as I traced the IP address of the loan application. It originated from a secure network located right here in Atlanta. I ran a packet sniffer protocol, peeling back the layers of network masking until I found the exact machine that authorized the application. The MAC address belonged to the computer sitting on the desk of the chief financial officer at Pierce Luxury Real Estate. It belonged to Preston. Preston was my white brother-in-law, married to DeAndre's sister Ebony. He was a man who reeked of unearned confidence and generational privilege. Preston had always treated me with a quiet, insidious hostility. He constantly made subtle, condescending remarks about my natural hair, my unpretentious wardrobe, and the working-class South Side neighborhood where I grew up. He loved to act as if my success was just a cute little hobby while treating the Pierce family real estate business like a massive global empire. But looking at the digital logs illuminating my screen, the truth was crystal clear. Preston had used his executive credentials as a corporate officer to verify DeAndre's fake income and pushed through a massive six-figure loan using my pristine credit score as collateral. They had stolen $100,000 in my name. I initiated a trace route to see exactly where that massive sum of money had gone. The digital trail bounced through a series of messy shell companies before landing in a completely untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I cross-referenced the routing numbers with a database of known illicit financial institutions. The account belonged to a notorious offshore gambling syndicate. DeAndre was not just trying to impress his parents with a luxury trip. He was burying a massive illegal gambling debt, and Preston had used his corporate authority to help him steal the money from me to cover it up. They honestly thought I would just sit back and take it. They thought I would be too distracted by the baby and the pain of labor to notice the financial ruin they had orchestrated. They thought they could use me as their personal bank and discard me when the funds ran dry. A cold, calculating anger washed over me completely, neutralizing the physical pain of my contractions. I did not feel like a victim. I felt like an executioner. I opened my command terminal and began writing a custom containment script. I started with the platinum credit cards DeAndre was currently holding in his expensive leather wallet. The cards he planned to use to buy expensive dinners and designer watches on the island. I bypassed the bank security questions and accessed the primary administrative dashboard. With 3 keystrokes, I revoked his authorized user status on every single account. I did not just freeze the cards. I permanently canceled them, triggering an immediate fraud alert to the global merchants network. Any attempt to swipe those cards would result in a hard decline and a confiscation warning. Next, I moved to his personal checking and savings accounts, the ones he used to pay his country club dues and his expensive car note. I utilized a legal financial protocol reserved for victims of identity theft, placing a hard, impenetrable lock on his entire financial identity. I changed the master passwords to complex 64-character alphanumeric strings that even a supercomputer would take decades to crack. I set up a 2-factor authentication protocol tied exclusively to my own biometric data. I systematically severed his access to everything. Without my direct fingerprint and retinal scan, DeAndre could not even buy a bottle of water. I watched the green lines of code execute flawlessly across my screen, confirming that the financial lockdowns were complete. DeAndre had flown to one of the most expensive islands on the planet, intending to live like a king on my dime. Instead, he was about to discover what it felt like to be completely broke and utterly powerless in a foreign country. He wanted to abandon me to face the hardest moment of my life alone, so I abandoned him to the merciless reality of his own choices. I closed the laptop, sliding it safely back into my overnight bag, just as a team of surgical nurses bustled into the room. They told me it was time. They wheeled my bed down the long, bright hallway toward the operating theater. The cold, sterile air of the surgical suite hit my face as they transferred me to the operating table. The anesthesiologist administered the spinal block, and within minutes the agonizing pain in my lower half faded into a strange, heavy numbness. A blue surgical drape was raised, shielding my view of my own abdomen. I stared at the bright surgical lights overhead, listening to the clinical chatter of the doctors and the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. I felt the intense pressure, the pulling and tugging as the surgical team worked quickly to bring my child into the world. I focused on the thought of my daughter, of the beautiful life I was going to build for her entirely on my own. She would never have to depend on a man who viewed her as an inconvenience. She would learn how to be strong, how to be fiercely independent, and how to protect herself. And then the most beautiful sound I had ever heard filled the cold operating room. It was a loud, indignant, piercing cry. Tears finally slipped down my cheeks, hot and fast, as the nurse brought my beautiful, perfect daughter around the drape so I could see her face. She was healthy, she was safe, and she was entirely mine. The overwhelming rush of pure, unconditional love pushed every thought of DeAndre and his toxic family out of my mind. 2 hours later, I was lying in a small, standard recovery room holding my swaddled baby girl tightly against my chest. The room was quiet, the hum of the hospital a distant, comforting background noise. I traced the soft curve of her cheek, marveling at how perfect she was. I promised her right then and there that no one would ever hurt her or diminish her value. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the harsh, vibrating buzz of my cell phone resting on the plastic tray table next to my bed. The dark screen illuminated, casting a pale light across the small hospital room. I reached over, carefully adjusting my sleeping daughter, and picked up the phone. The screen was completely flooded with notifications. There were 30 missed calls, all logged within the last 45 minutes. They were all from DeAndre. Underneath the missed calls was a frantic stream of text messages pouring in from St. Bart's. He was stranded at the resort. The credit cards were declining. The luxury hotel management was demanding immediate payment for the private villa and threatening to involve the island authorities. He was panicking, desperate, and completely out of options. I stared at the glowing screen, watching another incoming call from my husband flash across the display. The war had officially begun, and I held all the keys to the kingdom. The phone vibrated against the hard plastic of the hospital tray table, rattling with an urgency that matched the frantic incoming calls. I looked down at my daughter, sleeping peacefully against my chest, her tiny, warm breaths rising and falling in a perfect, steady rhythm. She was completely oblivious to the digital war I had just unleashed upon her father. I reached out with my free hand and swiped the green button to accept the video call. DeAndre's face instantly filled the screen, but the arrogant smirk he wore when he walked out of our bedroom was completely gone. His skin was flushed and slick with sweat, and his eyes were wide with a manic, panicked energy. He was standing in the middle of what looked like an opulent, open-air hotel lobby, with palm trees and marble columns visible behind him. In the background, I could see his mother, Vivian, pacing furiously, waving her hands at a hotel concierge who looked entirely unimpressed. "Jamila, what the hell is going on?" DeAndre demanded, his voice tight and breathless. The connection crackled slightly over the island network, but his sheer panic came through with perfect clarity. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if our child had been born safely. He did not even look at the tiny wrapped bundle resting against my heart. His entire focus was consumed by his sudden, immediate financial ruin. "I tried to buy a watch," he continued, practically panting into the camera. "I went to the boutique to buy a vintage Rolex to celebrate the trip, and my platinum card was declined." The clerk looked at me like I was some kind of street criminal. "They took the card and cut it right in front of me, Jamila. They said the bank reported it as compromised." And now the hotel manager is threatening to call the local island authorities because the deposit for the private villa bounced. The wire transfer was recalled. My parents are sitting on their luggage in the lobby, and they are about to throw us out onto the street. I adjusted my hold on my daughter, keeping my expression completely blank. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to sit in his own rising terror. He ran a shaking hand over his face. "You need to call the bank right now." DeAndre ordered, his tone shifting from panic to that familiar demanding authority he always tried to use to control me. "You must have missed a security alert or forgotten to pay the premium balance before you went to the hospital. Call them and authorize the charges immediately, Jamila. This is humiliating. My father is furious, and my mother is crying because the hotel staff is treating us like common thieves. Fix this right now." I stared into the camera, looking at the man who had stolen my maternity savings to fund his vanity. I looked at the man who had abandoned his pregnant wife during a medical emergency just so he could sip cocktails on a white sand beach. He truly believed this was just a simple banking error. His arrogance was so deeply ingrained that he could not even fathom that the quiet, obedient woman from the South Side had systematically dismantled his entire life in less than 3 hours. "That is the price you pay," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling calm that cut right through his frantic demands. DeAndre stopped talking. His mouth fell slightly open as the realization slowly began to dawn on his sweating face. He stared at me through the screen, his eyes darting frantically as he finally noticed the sterile hospital walls behind me and the tiny sleeping baby in my arms. "Jamila, what did you do?" he whispered, the arrogant demands completely vanishing from his tone. I did not explain. I did not yell or cry or offer him the satisfaction of an argument. I simply reached forward and pressed the red button to end the call. Then I immediately opened my phone settings and permanently blocked his number and the numbers of his parents. The silence that returned to the recovery room felt incredibly peaceful. I spent the next few hours simply existing in the quiet bubble of my hospital room. The nurses came and went, checking my vitals and bringing me water. They marveled at how alert and calm I was for a woman who had just undergone major abdominal surgery. I held my daughter, marveling at the tiny perfection of her fingers and the soft, dark curls covering her head. I felt a profound sense of clarity. The toxic weight of the Pierce family expectations was finally gone. I had severed the cord and I was ready to move forward. But the Pierce family was not used to losing control, and they were certainly not used to being challenged by someone they viewed as deeply beneath their social standing. The heavy wooden door of my recovery room suddenly swung open with a violent thud, hitting the rubber stopper on the wall. The sudden noise startled my daughter, causing her to squirm and let out a soft cry of protest. I instinctively curled my body protectively around her, looking up to see who had dared to intrude on our peace. It was Ebony, my sister-in-law, and her husband Preston. Ebony was dressed in a tight designer tracksuit, clutching an oversized luxury handbag, her face contorted into an ugly scowl. Preston stood right behind her, his tall frame looming in the doorway. Preston was the chief financial officer of the Pierce real estate firm and the architect of the fraudulent offshore loan that had nearly ruined my credit. He was a white man who had married into the affluent black family and always carried himself with an insufferable air of quiet superiority. He loved to weaponize his corporate vocabulary to talk down to me, treating me like an uneducated subordinate rather than an equal member of the family. Neither of them looked at the baby. Neither of them asked how the surgery went. Ebony marched right up to the side of my hospital bed, pointing an acrylic fingernail directly at my face. "What kind of sick game are you playing, Jamila?" she demanded, her voice shrill and echoing in the small room. My mother is literally sobbing in a public lobby in St. Bart's. They were escorted off the resort property by security guards. DeAndre called us from a prepaid local phone, sounding like a complete lunatic, saying you did something to the bank accounts. I gently shushed my baby, rocking her slightly to calm her down while maintaining unbroken eye contact with Ebony. I did not say a word. I simply let her manic energy bounce off my absolute calm. Preston stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on his wife's shoulder to gently pull her back. He adjusted his tailored blazer and looked down at me with a sickeningly paternalistic smile. It was the exact same condescending smile he used whenever I tried to contribute to conversations at their lavish family dinners. "Let me handle this, Ebony," he said smoothly, before turning his cold, pale eyes onto me. "All right, Jamila. Let's be rational about this. We all know you are dealing with a lot of heavy postpartum emotions right now. Your hormones are all over the place and you are clearly lashing out because DeAndre took a few days off for a family trip. It is very common for women in your position to act irrationally." He paused, letting his insulting psychological assessment hang in the air, as if it were a proven medical fact. "But this little tantrum ends right now," he continued, his tone hardening into a strict professional command. "I got an alert from our banking partners about a massive security freeze on DeAndre's primary accounts and some red flags concerning an offshore wire transfer. I do not know what kind of amateur hack you managed to pull off with your little IT background, but you are dealing with real money now. You are messing with Pierce family assets. I need you to unlock those accounts immediately so I can clean up this mess and wire them funds to get back into their hotel." I shifted slightly, wincing as a dull ache radiated from my surgical incision, but I refused to show them any signs of weakness. "The accounts belong to me, Preston," I said, my voice steady and quiet. "DeAndre drained our joint savings to pay for that trip, and then he used a fraudulent loan to cover his gambling debts. A loan that you personally authorized using my credit profile as collateral. Those funds have been permanently frozen pending a federal investigation." Ebony's mouth dropped open in shock, but Preston just let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He crossed his arms over his chest, leaning over my bed to intimidate me with his physical presence. "Who exactly do you think you are, Jamila?" he asked, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You are just a mediocre it girl who sits behind a desk resetting passwords all day. The Pierce family took pity on you. We welcomed you into a legacy of wealth and prestige that you never could have achieved on your own. You came from a broken-down neighborhood on the South Side, and we elevated you. You should be on your knees thanking us for giving you a comfortable life instead of playing these pathetic little hacker games." Ebony eagerly chimed in, emboldened by her husband's arrogant speech. "You are pathetic," she sneered. "You are just bitter because DeAndre finally got tired of your constant complaining and decided to go have fun with people on his own level. Unlock the damn accounts right now, or Preston will personally call the executives at your little tech company and have you fired by the end of the day. You will be back in the projects begging for food before the week is over." They were so incredibly predictable. They operated entirely on intimidation and the false belief that their perceived social and racial hierarchies made them invincible. They thought they could crush me by threatening my employment, completely unaware of the massive unseen reality standing right in front of them. I smiled. It was a slow, cold smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I carefully placed my sleeping daughter in the clear plastic bassinet resting securely beside my bed. I made sure she was perfectly swaddled and safe before reaching over to grab the heavy laptop resting on my side table. Ebony scoffed, rolling her eyes. "What are you doing opening your email to send an apology to your boss?" I opened the laptop screen, typing in my complex master passcode with rapid, precise keystrokes. I did not look at them as I pulled up the central administrative terminal for my cybersecurity firm. "You are severely mistaken about a few things, Preston," I said, my fingers flying across the illuminated keys. "First of all, I do not reset passwords for a living. I am the founder and sole owner of Apex Digital Security. My little tech company currently holds government contracts worth more than your father-in-law's entire real estate portfolio." Preston's condescending smile finally faltered slightly, his brow furrowing as he tried to process what I was saying. He glanced at the complex lines of encrypted data running across my screen, and a flicker of genuine uncertainty passed through his eyes. Secondly, I continued, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Your entire corporate infrastructure, Pierce Luxury Real Estate, relies exclusively on my company's servers for your cloud hosting, your client databases, and your secure financial portals. You signed the vendor agreement 3 years ago, Preston. You authorized the migration of all your corporate data to Apex Digital Security. You just never bothered to read the name of the primary shareholder on the contract because you were too busy looking down on me at the dinner table. Ebony looked at Preston, her face twisting with confusion. Preston? What is she talking about? Tell her to stop talking nonsense and fix the bank accounts. But Preston was not looking at Ebony. The color was rapidly draining from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the harsh fluorescent hospital lights. He took a step back from my bed, his eyes locked onto my computer screen as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He finally understood the magnitude of his fatal error. He had authorized a fraudulent $100,000 loan against the identity of the very person who controlled the digital keys to his entire corporate empire. I tapped a few final commands into the terminal, bringing up the master control panel for the Pierce Real Estate client partition. I looked directly into Preston's terrified eyes. "And finally, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed loudly in the silent room. "You are correct about one thing. I am dealing with real money now." I brought my finger down hard on the enter key. Instantly, Preston's cell phone began to vibrate violently in his breast pocket. A loud, blaring emergency alarm erupted from the device, a specialized sound designed to notify corporate officers of a catastrophic critical system failure. Ebony jumped backward, her hands flying to her ears as the deafening sound filled the small hospital room. Preston scrambled to pull the phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it onto the linoleum floor. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing as he read the automated alerts flooding his display. Server access revoked. Client database encrypted. Financial portals locked. He looked up at me, his arrogant superiority completely shattered, replaced entirely by blind, primal panic. The blaring alarms from his phone continued to scream, signaling the absolute destruction of his corporate world. And I just sat back against my pillows, pulling my warm blanket up to my chest and smiled. The automatic sliding doors of Atlanta General Hospital parted, and the thick, humid air of a Georgia afternoon washed over me. I was sitting in a hospital-issued wheelchair, clutching my newborn daughter tightly against my chest, while a kind discharge nurse pushed me toward the designated pickup zone. Every tiny bump in the pavement sent a sharp flare of agonizing pain radiating from my C-section incision, but I refused to let it show on my face. I had spent the last 48 hours operating in a state of hyper-focused survival mode. After completely locking DeAndre out of his financial existence and paralyzing the Pierce family real estate servers, I had finally allowed myself to rest. I held my baby girl and planned our new life. A life completely free from the toxic, suffocating grip of a family that had constantly treated me like a lower-class charity case. My private car service pulled up to the curb. The driver carefully helped me into the back seat and securely fastened my daughter's pristine new car seat. As we pulled away from the hospital, I leaned my head against the cool, tinted glass of the window and watched the city skyline roll by. I fully anticipated a massive retaliation from the Pierce family. I knew Reginald and Vivian would not simply roll over and accept defeat. They were the kind of wealthy, arrogant people who believed they were utterly invincible. They thought their money and their social status made them untouchable. I expected them to hire expensive lawyers to send threatening cease and desist letters, or perhaps to attempt a hostile corporate takeover of my cybersecurity firm. I had already briefed my own legal team, preparing them for a massive digital and financial war. But as the car turned onto my familiar tree-lined street in my quiet upscale neighborhood, I quickly realized that I had severely underestimated the sheer petty vindictiveness of my father-in-law. A cold, heavy knot of absolute dread formed in the pit of my stomach as my house came into view. My beautiful custom-built brick home, the sanctuary I had carefully curated and paid for with my own blood, sweat, and tears, looked like the scene of a violent eviction, scattered chaotically across the wide wrap around front porch and spilling down onto the meticulously manicured front lawn were dozens of cardboard moving boxes and black heavy-duty trash bags. I pressed my face against the car window, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I could see my favorite winter coats hanging haphazardly over the porch railing. I saw my collection of rare first edition books dumped carelessly into a plastic bin. I saw the expensive ergonomic monitors from my home office sitting completely unprotected on the concrete steps. They had even thrown out the pastel-colored gift bags and wrapped boxes from my recent baby shower. They had literally taken my entire life and tossed it onto the street like garbage. I paid the driver and tipped him extra to help me carry the car seat up the driveway. I walked slowly, testing my physical limits with every step. My mind was racing, calculating the legal ramifications of what I was seeing. I took a deep, cleansing breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I was not going to let them see me panic. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a tearful emotional breakdown. I smoothed my hair, adjusted my jacket, and walked through the wide open front door of my own home. The scene inside the grand foyer was even more infuriating. Sitting on my expensive custom-ordered velvet sofa looking entirely too comfortable and arrogant were my father-in-law Reginald and my brother-in-law Preston. Reginald looked absolutely exhausted and uncharacteristically disheveled. He had clearly flown back from St. Bart's on a miserable last-minute budget airline the second their luxury vacation funds had miraculously evaporated. His designer linen suit was heavily wrinkled. His face was red with a mixture of tropical sunburn and pure, uncontrollable rage, and he was sweating profusely. Standing directly behind them, with their arms crossed over their chests and looking incredibly uncomfortable, were two uniformed Atlanta police officers. The moment I crossed the threshold into the living room, Reginald shot up from the sofa. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. "There she is, officers," he barked, his deep voice booming aggressively through the high ceilings of my house. "That is the woman who maliciously hacked our corporate servers and stole my son's money. I want her arrested right now. Put her in handcuffs." I gently and carefully placed my daughter's car seat on the heavy, solid oak dining table, completely ignoring Reginald's loud, aggressive shouting. I took a moment to ensure the blanket was perfectly tucked around her tiny sleeping form. Only then did I turn my attention to the men occupying my living room. I looked at the two police officers who were shifting their weight nervously, clearly unsure of how to proceed, with a calm woman holding a newborn baby. Preston stepped forward, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across his pale face. He was holding a thick, heavy manila envelope in his hands. "You really thought you could just lock us out of our own company and get away with it, Jamila?" he sneered, his voice dripping with that familiar condescending tone he always used to belittle me. "Did you actually believe we would not fight back? You are nothing but a common cybercriminal from the South Side, and we are pressing full federal charges against you and your little tech company. But first we are taking out the trash." He tossed the thick envelope onto the dining table, letting it slide until it stopped right next to my baby. "Those are divorce papers, Jamila. DeAndre had his legal team draft them up the exact second we realized what you did to our bank accounts. He is filing for full sole custody of the child, by the way, citing your obvious mental instability and your criminal behavior." Reginald puffed out his chest, walking over to stand next to Preston. They formed a united front of privileged arrogance. "This house belongs to my son Jamila," he stated confidently. "It has been legally in his name since long before he made the unfortunate mistake of marrying beneath his station. We had a professional moving crew come in this morning and pack up your pathetic little wardrobe. You have exactly 2 hours to get the rest of your garbage off my son's property before I have these officers formally charge you with trespassing, breaking and entering, and cyber-sabotage." I stood perfectly still, letting their arrogant threats wash over me like water off a stone. They were so incredibly predictable. They relied entirely on intimidation and the false, unearned authority of their wealth. They had brought the police here specifically to scare me, to force me into a blind panic, so I would hand over the server decryption keys and beg for their mercy. They wanted me to feel small, powerless, and trapped. They wanted the poor girl from the rough neighborhood to break down and cry. I looked directly at the police officers, keeping my voice completely calm, level, and devoid of any emotional inflection. Officers, I said politely, I am the sole legal resident and owner of this property. These men have broken into my home while I was in the hospital, recovering from major surgery, and they have illegally removed my personal belongings. I would like to formally press charges for breaking and entering burglary and property damage. Reginald let out a loud, booming laugh, slapping Preston hard on the back. Listen to her trying to play the victim, he scoffed, shaking his head. Officer, I can show you the original deed to this house right now on my phone. My son, DeAndre Pierce, purchased this property 3 years ago with his own money. She has absolutely no legal right to be here, especially after what she did to our business network. She is a hostile actor and she needs to be removed from the premises immediately. The older of the two police officers stepped forward, pulling a small black notepad and a pen from his uniform pocket. Ma'am, we received a priority call from Mr. Pierce about a domestic dispute and allegations of severe cybercrimes. He has already provided us with documentation showing that the house is registered to his son, DeAndre Pierce. If you are currently facing divorce proceedings, as they claim, you might need to vacate the premises today to avoid a civil disturbance. We do not want to arrest a new mother, but we have to follow the law regarding property rights. I nodded slowly, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the officer. I understood exactly how Preston and Reginald had spun the narrative. They had used their expensive suits, their confident corporate vocabulary, and their status as wealthy businessmen to convince the police that I was just an angry, bitter ex-wife seeking illegal revenge. I turned my back on Reginald and Preston, walking slowly and deliberately toward the massive built-in bookshelf in the corner of the living room. I kept a hidden fireproof biometric safe concealed behind a row of heavy vintage encyclopedias. I pressed my thumb to the scanner, listening for the soft electronic click of the locking mechanism. I pulled open the heavy steel door and retrieved a thick blue legal binder. I walked back to the dining table and handed the heavy binder directly to the older police officer. I highly suggest you look at the current updated property records, officer, I said quietly, tapping the cover of the binder. What Reginald and Preston do not know, because my husband was entirely too much of a coward to ever tell them, is that DeAndre secretly mortgaged this house 2 years ago. He took out a massive high-interest predatory loan to cover his illegal offshore gambling debts that he accumulated while pretending to be closing real estate deals. He completely defaulted on those loan payments 6 months later. The bank foreclosed on the property quietly and put it up for private commercial auction. The entire room went completely dead silent. Reginald's face physically dropped, the arrogant red coloring draining away instantly to leave him looking pale and sickeningly gray. Preston snatched the binder out of the police officer's hands, frantically flipping through the dense legal documents, his eyes scanning the highlighted sections with rising panic. "That is absolutely impossible," Reginald sputtered, his voice completely losing all of its booming, confident authority. DeAndre would never do that. He makes 6 figures a year. He is a vice president. He does not have gambling debts. You are lying. This is another one of your fraudulent schemes. You really do not know your own son at all, do you, Reginald? I replied, folding my arms across my chest and watching Preston read the foreclosure notices with widening, terrified eyes. The house went to auction, and it was purchased in full with straight cash by a private commercial real estate investment firm called Onyx Holdings, LLC. They hold the absolute legal deed to this property free and clear. DeAndre Pierce has not owned this house for over 2 years. He has been paying rent to a corporate entity just to keep up appearances. Preston looked up from the heavy binder, his hands shaking so violently that the papers rattled. He swallowed hard, looking at Reginald with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "The paperwork is real," Reginald Preston whispered, his voice cracking. "It has the official county seals. Onyx Holdings owns the property. DeAndre lost the house. The older police officer frowned, taking the binder back from Preston and examining the documents himself. "Okay, Mom," he said, his tone shifting to one of respectful confusion. "So a private corporate company owns the house. But what does that have to do with your right to be here right now? Why shouldn't we ask you to leave if the company owns it?" I smiled, resting my hand gently on the handle of my daughter's car seat. I looked directly at Reginald, letting the full, heavy weight of my next words sink into the quiet, tense room. "It matters, officer, because I am the sole proprietor, the managing director, and the 100% owner of Onyx Holdings, LLC. I created the holding company, and I bought this house at auction to save my foolish husband from going to federal prison for bank fraud. I am the landlord. I am the owner of record. And these two men are currently trespassing on my private property." The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. The police officers immediately shifted their stance, their hands resting casually on their utility belts as they turned to face Reginald and Preston. The power dynamic in the room had instantly and irreversibly reversed. Reginald and Preston were no longer the wealthy, untouchable elite commanding the room and dictating the rules. They were common intruders standing illegally in the home of the woman they had just tried to throw out onto the street. "Sir," the older officer said to Reginald, his tone completely stripping away all the previous deference and respect. "You and your associate need to step outside right now. You have illegally removed the property owner's belongings from the premises, and you are officially trespassing. If you do not leave this house in the next 30 seconds, you will both be leaving in handcuffs and going to the county jail." Reginald looked like he was going to have a massive heart attack right there on my custom rug. He opened his mouth to argue, to yell, to use his prestigious family name to force compliance, but the absolute uncompromising authority in the police officer's eyes stopped him cold. He was completely trapped. Preston grabbed Reginald's arm, pulling him urgently toward the open front door, realizing that arguing with the police would only end in their arrest. "This is not over," Jamila Preston hissed, his face twisted with profound humiliation and impotent rage as he backed toward the doorway. "We will see you in federal court for what you did to our business servers. You are going to pay for this." As they shuffled past the dining table, completely defeated and utterly humiliated in front of the police, I leaned in close to Reginald. I kept my voice to a soft, terrifying whisper meant only for his ears. "You should really coordinate your finances better with your chief financial officer." "Reginald," I whispered, watching his eyes widen in fresh, sudden fear. "Onyx Holdings LLC does not just own this residential house. We also happen to be the parent company that recently purchased the 30-story commercial high-rise building downtown. The exact same building where Pierce Luxury Real Estate leases its entire corporate headquarters. You might want to check your office mail, Reginald. I think your commercial lease is severely past due, and I do not tolerate late tenants." I stood back and watched the absolute total horror wash over his face. His knees actually buckled slightly as the realization hit him. I owned their home, and I owned their business headquarters. The police officers firmly escorted them out of my house and down the long driveway. The front door clicked shut, finally sealing them out, and I was safely home. The heavy oak door clicked shut, and a profound silence settled over the grand foyer. I stood perfectly still for a moment, letting the reality of my victory wash over me. My newborn daughter shifted in her car seat, letting out a soft sigh that grounded me instantly. I picked her up carefully, breathing in that sweet newborn scent, and walked into the nursery I had designed with my own money. The Pierce family thought they had broken me, but all they had done was awaken a dormant storm. I gently placed my baby in her crib and pulled my laptop from my bag, setting it up on the nursing chair. My cell phone began to vibrate violently across the wooden dresser. I glanced at the screen and saw a flood of notifications pouring in from every social media platform. Friends, colleagues, and distant relatives were tagging me relentlessly. I opened the application and found exactly what I expected. Vivian and Ebony were broadcasting live to thousands of people in their affluent Atlanta circle. The background was jarring. Instead of the sprawling infinity pool and private chef they had bragged about, they were crammed into a dingy, dimly lit motel room in St. Bart's. Peeling wallpaper and a stained mattress framed Vivian's tear-streaked face. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her designer makeup was carefully smudged to look like she had been crying for hours. "Look what she did to us!" Vivian wailed, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest. "My own daughter-in-law, Jamila Pierce, has lost her mind. She used some kind of computer virus to steal our money and lock us out of our accounts. We are stranded on an island with nothing." Ebony leaned into the frame, her face twisted with vicious anger. "She is a gold digger from the South Side who manipulated my brother." Ebony spat into the camera. "She kicked our father out of his own house and she kidnapped my newborn niece. Please, someone help us. She is dangerous and completely unhinged." I watched the viewer count climb higher and higher as the comments flooded in with people expressing shock and outrage. They were playing the ultimate victim card, twisting the narrative to make me look like a deranged criminal who had stolen their wealth. They were trying to destroy my reputation in the very community they paraded around in. I felt a brief flash of heat in my chest, but it quickly cooled into absolute focus. I did not care about their fake tears or their social standing. I swiped the screen closed and put the phone on Do Not Disturb. Let them cry to their country club friends. I had real work to do. I turned my attention back to my glowing laptop screen. Since Pierce Luxury Real Estate had officially defaulted on their commercial lease and violated the terms of their vendor agreement with Apex Digital Security, I had complete legal authority to hold their corporate servers in quarantine. I routed my connection through a series of encrypted proxies and opened the raw data ledgers of their business operations. Preston and Reginald paraded around as titans of industry, but I knew their arrogant facade was hiding something much darker than just DeAndre's gambling debts. My fingers flew across the keyboard, deploying a custom forensic algorithm designed to hunt for anomalies in vast financial databases. I bypassed their basic encryption protocols like I was opening a paper envelope. I dug deep into the hidden directories, isolating the escrow accounts and the operating budgets. What I found made my blood run completely cold. It was not just corporate mismanagement. It was a massive predatory fraud scheme, line by line, transaction by transaction. The truth unspooled across my screen. Reginald and Preston had been systematically targeting low-income Black families in the very South Side neighborhoods they constantly mocked. They were taking huge cash deposits for affordable housing projects that were never actually built. They would string these families along with fake construction delays and legal loopholes before quietly declaring the projects bankrupt and keeping the escrow funds. They were bleeding my community dry to fund their luxury cars and country club memberships. But the most brilliant and cowardly part of their scheme was the money laundering protocol. Preston had meticulously routed every single stolen deposit through a complex web of shell companies. I followed the digital breadcrumbs backwards until they converged into one central hub. All the stolen money was being funneled directly through accounts registered solely in DeAndre's name. Preston and Reginald were not just thieves. They had intentionally set up DeAndre as the ultimate fall guy. If the federal authorities ever looked into the missing funds, the entire paper trail would point directly to my arrogant, foolish husband, while Preston and Reginald walked away completely clean. I sat in the quiet nursery, the glow of the screen reflecting off my face as a dark sense of justice settled in my bones. They thought I was just a technical support girl. They had handed a master key to the very woman who had the power to burn their fake empire to the ground. I opened a secure file compiler and began dragging every ledger, every fraudulent contract, and every illegal wire transfer into an encrypted folder. I packaged the entire damning history of Pierce Luxury Real Estate into a single digital payload. I addressed the secure transfer to the lead investigator of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division in Atlanta. I moved my cursor over the send button, ready to end their legacy forever. Suddenly, the sharp chime of the front doorbell echoed through the silent house. I paused, my hand hovering over the mouse pad. I pulled up the live feed from my front porch security camera. Standing on my welcome mat, looking completely deranged and furious, was DeAndre. His designer clothes were rumpled and stained from whatever cheap flight he had managed to beg his way onto. His face was tight with desperate rage. But he was not alone. Standing on either side of him were two stern-looking women wearing official state badges around their necks. They were agents from Child Protective Services. DeAndre looked directly up into the camera lens. "Open the door, Jamila," he shouted, his voice muffled but audible through the thick wood. "You have lost your mind. I am here to take my daughter. These women know all about your severe postpartum psychosis, and they are here to remove the baby for her own safety." I looked from the security feed to my sleeping daughter and back to the massive file of federal evidence waiting on my screen. DeAndre was trying to use my own child as a pawn in his desperate game. He had no idea he was already standing in the ashes of his own life. I took a deep, steadying breath and walked slowly toward the heavy oak front door. I did not rush. I did not let the panic he was trying to incite take root in my mind. I simply checked my reflection in the hallway mirror, smoothing down my comfortable maternity clothes and making sure my face was a perfect mask of calm, absolute control. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. DeAndre immediately launched into a theatrical performance that belonged on a soap opera stage. He fell to his knees on the welcome mat, burying his face in his hands and letting out a loud, exaggerated sob. He looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive designer shirt was stained with sweat and dirt from his frantic journey back from the Caribbean. His hair was unkempt, and he smelled faintly of stale alcohol and sheer desperation. The two Child Protective Services agents standing behind him looked deeply uncomfortable, but maintained their professional composure. The older agent, a woman with sharp, observant eyes, stepped forward and displayed her official identification badge. She introduced herself as Agent Collins and explained that they had received an urgent emergency report regarding the safety and well-being of a newborn infant on the premises. DeAndre pointed a shaking finger at me, his face twisted into a mask of fake anguish. He told them I was completely unhinged. He claimed I was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis and that I had kidnapped our daughter from the hospital against medical advice. He leaned heavily into his prejudices, weaponizing my background right there on the front porch. He told the agents that I grew up in a dangerous neighborhood on the South Side and that my ghetto mentality had finally snapped under the pressure of motherhood. He painted a picture of me as a violent, unstable woman who was holding his child hostage out of pure spite. He begged them to go inside and rescue his baby girl before I did something irreversible. He claimed he had rushed back from a mandatory business trip the second he realized I was having a mental breakdown. I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms or display any defensive body language. I knew exactly how this system worked, and I knew that the slightest hint of anger would only validate his ridiculous lies. I offered Agent Collins a polite, gentle smile and stepped back, opening the door wide to invite them inside. I told them I completely understood their concern and that they were more than welcome to inspect my home and check on my daughter. DeAndre tried to push his way past them, but the younger agent firmly told him to wait outside on the porch until they had assessed the situation. I led the two agents into my immaculate living room. The house was completely silent, peaceful, and spotless. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large bay windows, illuminating the pristine hardwood floors and the expensive modern furniture. There was absolutely no sign of chaos or instability. I walked them over to the digital baby monitor sitting on the kitchen island, pointing to the high-definition video feed of my daughter sleeping peacefully in her luxury crib. I offered the agents a seat at the dining table and asked if they would like a glass of water. Agent Collins watched me carefully, clearly confused by the stark contrast between DeAndre's frantic screaming outside and my absolute serene composure inside. She took out her notepad and asked me to explain why my husband believed I was having a psychotic break. I sat down across from her, resting my hands calmly on the polished wood of the table. I explained that my husband was currently experiencing a severe financial crisis of his own making and was attempting to use our newborn daughter as a tool for retaliation. Agent Collins frowned slightly, asking me to elaborate. She mentioned that DeAndre had claimed I was financially dependent on his wealthy family and that I had locked him out of his own bank accounts in a fit of manic rage. I did not argue with her. I simply stood up and walked over to my secure fireproof safe. I pulled out a stack of manila folders and a silver external hard drive. I brought them back to the table and laid them out in a neat, organized row. I believe hard data speaks louder than emotional accusations, I told the agents, pushing the first folder across the table. I asked them to review the financial documents inside. They opened the folder, and their eyes widened as they read through my certified corporate tax returns and the absolute proof of my sole ownership of Apex Digital Security. I showed them the deed to the house, which belonged entirely to my private holding company. I showed them the itemized hospital bills from my delivery, which had been paid in full directly from my personal premium accounts. I proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the sole provider for our household and that DeAndre was essentially a financial parasite, living entirely off my hard work. The younger agent looked through the tax returns, her jaw dropping slightly as she registered the seven-figure income I generated annually. DeAndre had painted me as a destitute, desperate woman from the South Side clinging to his family wealth. But the paperwork proved I was a highly successful tech CEO who could buy and sell his entire family twice over. But financial stability is only one part of the equation. I continued sliding my sleek laptop onto the table and plugging in the external hard drive. My husband claimed he was away on a mandatory business trip when I went into labor. I think you should see exactly how he left this house. I pulled up the encrypted security footage from our master bedroom. The high-definition video filled the screen, showing the exact date and timestamp from just a few days ago. The agents leaned in closer, watching the silent, undeniable truth unfold. The video clearly showed me bent over the edge of the mahogany dresser, gripping the wood in absolute blinding agony as a massive contraction ripped through my body. It showed DeAndre standing less than 5 feet away, completely ignoring my pain. It showed him meticulously folding his brightly colored silk shirts and packing his expensive leather vacation bag. It showed him humming a cheerful tune and checking his luxury watch, while I begged him not to leave me alone. The agents watched in horrified silence as the video captured DeAndre pressing a dismissive kiss to my sweaty forehead, grabbing his suitcase and casually walking out the door, abandoning his pregnant wife to go on a luxury vacation to St. Bart's. Agent Collins let out a sharp breath of disgust, leaning back in her chair. She looked toward the front door where DeAndre was still pacing and shouting muffled threats. The entire narrative he had constructed to weaponize Child Protective Services had just collapsed into dust. He had tried to frame me as an unfit mother, but the video proved he was an utterly callous and neglectful father. But I was not finished. I had promised myself that I would dismantle every single piece of his fake existence. I slid the final folder across the table toward the agents. When I discovered that my husband had stolen my maternity savings to fund his tropical vacation, I initiated a legal financial lockdown on my accounts. I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. He was stranded on the island without access to my money. Unfortunately, my husband does not handle the word no very well. What you are holding is a certified translated police report that I acquired directly from the local authorities in St. Bart's. Agent Collins opened the folder, reading the official police document. Her eyes scanned the paragraphs and her professional demeanor hardened into a mask of pure, serious authority. The report detailed how DeAndre had thrown a violent tantrum at the luxury resort when his credit cards were declined. He had become incredibly aggressive and disorderly, threatening the hotel staff and breaking a lobby display case. The local island police had been called to escort him off the property. But the most damning part of the report was what happened during his arrest. The police had searched his pockets during the detainment procedure and found illegal narcotics. He had been formally detained overnight for drug possession and disorderly conduct in a foreign country. His parents had been forced to liquidate their own emergency funds to bail him out and put him on the first cheap flight back to Atlanta. "He is not here out of concern for our daughter," I told the agents, my voice cold and absolute. "He is here because he is a desperate broke addict who just caught a drug charge in the Caribbean, and he thinks he can terrorize me into giving him his lavish lifestyle back. He is the one who poses a severe danger to this child." The two agents looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. The younger agent immediately stood up and pulled out her radio, stepping away to make a priority call to her supervisor. Agent Collins closed the folders, gathering the evidence into a neat stack. She looked at me with a profound mixture of respect and deep professional concern. She apologized for the intrusion and assured me that my daughter was perfectly safe in my custody. She then stated that the focus of their investigation was going to shift entirely onto DeAndre, based on the drug charges and the documented history of neglect. We walked together toward the front door. I unlocked it and pulled it open, stepping out onto the porch with the agents flanking me on either side. DeAndre stopped pacing the moment he saw us, his face lighting up with a cruel, triumphant smirk. He honestly thought they were bringing him good news. He thought his manipulative tears had worked. "Well," he sneered, crossing his arms and looking down at me. "Are you ready to stop being crazy, Jamila? Go get my daughter right now and pack her bag. You are going to a psychiatric ward." Agent Collins stepped right into his personal space, her posture rigid and unyielding. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "Based on the substantial evidence provided, including your recent detainment for narcotics possession in St. Bart's, we are initiating a formal investigation into your fitness as a parent. You are not to approach the child or this property." DeAndre's arrogant smirk vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer dumbfounded panic. He stumbled backwards, sputtering and shaking his head. "What narcotics?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "She is lying. She hacked something. She made that up. She is a cyber terrorist. You cannot believe her." Before he could launch into another manic tirade, the sound of heavy boots crunching on the gravel driveway interrupted him. The two police officers who had previously escorted Reginald and Preston off the property had not gone far. I had retained them on standby, knowing exactly how volatile DeAndre would be when he finally arrived. They marched up the porch steps, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. "DeAndre Pierce," the older officer said, stepping between DeAndre and the front door. "We have an emergency protective order filed against you by the homeowner. Given your current erratic behavior and the active Child Protective Services investigation, you need to vacate these premises immediately, or you will be placed under arrest for violating a restraining order." DeAndre looked wildly around him, completely surrounded by the police, the child protective agents, and the cold, hard reality of his own destruction. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, the panic finally consuming him entirely. He looked at me, his eyes begging for mercy, pleading for the quiet, obedient wife to swoop in and save him from the consequences of his actions. I just stood on the porch of my beautiful house, folding my arms and looking right through him. He was nothing to me now, just a pathetic footnote in a life I was already rewriting. The officers did not give him time to argue. They grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back with practiced efficiency. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the quiet suburban street was the most satisfying sound I had heard all day. DeAndre began to thrash and scream, his voice echoing with sheer hysterical desperation as they dragged him down the steps and shoved him into the back of the waiting patrol car. I watched the police cruiser pull away, the flashing red and blue lights, reflecting off the perfectly manicured lawns of my neighborhood. The child protective agents thanked me again for my cooperation and walked to their own vehicle, leaving me alone on the quiet porch. I turned around and walked back inside, locking the heavy oak door behind me. The house was completely silent, peaceful and safe. I walked back into the nursery, looking down at my daughter as she slept entirely untouched by the chaos outside. I smiled gently, tracing the soft curve of her cheek, knowing that our real beautiful life was just beginning. The peace I felt in that nursery was absolute. But I knew the Pierce family well enough to know it would be temporary. They were like cornered animals, and cornered animals do not surrender. They lash out. Within 48 hours of DeAndre's humiliating arrest on my front porch, the retaliation began. Reginald and Vivian did what old money pretenders always do when their backs are against the wall. They threw exorbitant amounts of cash at the problem. They hired Atlanta's most notoriously aggressive defense attorney, a ruthless man named Sterling, who specialized in burying his opponents under mountains of legal paperwork and fabricated scandals. The process server arrived at my front gate on a Tuesday morning, handing over a massive stack of legal documents. Sterling had filed a $20 million civil lawsuit against Apex Digital Security, accusing me of corporate sabotage, economic espionage, and breach of fiduciary duty. But the financial lawsuit was merely a distraction from their true weapon. Buried at the bottom of the stack was a petition for full physical and legal custody of my daughter. DeAndre, despite currently facing federal drug charges and violating a protective order, was claiming that my actions against their servers were proof of severe postpartum psychosis. They were trying to paint me as a deranged, vindictive woman who was using her child and her hacking skills to destroy a prominent Atlanta family. Preston was not sitting idle either. He decided to use his country club memberships and generational privilege to wage a shadow war against my business. He began reaching out to his affluent network, making quiet phone calls to several of my secondary tech partners and investors. He spun a ridiculous narrative claiming that Apex Digital Security was a volatile rogue operation, and subtly implying that anyone who continued to do business with me would find themselves cut off from the Pierce luxury real estate network. He honestly thought he could intimidate me by threatening my professional reputation. He assumed that because I was a young black woman from the South Side, I would easily crumble under the weight of his old boys club connections. He severely underestimated the loyalty I had built in the cybersecurity sector. My partners did not drop me. Instead, they forwarded every single one of Preston's threatening voicemails directly to my encrypted inbox, providing me with a beautiful digital trail of corporate extortion. I did not panic. I did not hire a public relations firm to release a defensive statement. I simply let them scream into the void, completely ignoring their expensive lawyers and their desperate smear campaigns. Instead of responding to their chaos, I focused on celebrating the one thing that truly mattered. I decided to host a sip and see for my daughter. It is a classic Southern tradition, a gentle, elegant afternoon gathering where close friends and chosen family can drop by to meet the new baby. I kept the guest list incredibly small and fiercely protected. I hired a private catering company to set up a beautiful display of delicate pastries and sparkling cider on the back patio overlooking the pristine gardens of the estate that Onyx Holdings legally owned. My house was filled with the soft sounds of genuine laughter and the warmth of people who actually loved me for who I was, not for what I could provide them. My daughter wore a tiny pale yellow dress, resting perfectly content in the arms of my former college roommate, who had flown in just for the occasion. But amidst the small circle of trusted friends, I had invited one very specific guest who did not fit the usual profile of a baby shower attendee. He arrived right on time, dressed in a sharp, unassuming gray suit. Special Agent Marcus Hayes from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division. He was the lead investigator who had received the massive encrypted payload of financial ledgers I had compiled, while Vivian and Ebony were busy crying on social media. Agent Hayes accepted a glass of sparkling cider and walked with me toward the quiet edge of the patio away from the chatter of the other guests. He looked out over the perfectly manicured lawn before turning his sharp, observant eyes to me. He did not speak to me like I was a suspect or a bitter ex-wife. He spoke to me like a highly respected colleague. He quietly confirmed that the digital evidence I had provided was some of the most meticulously organized forensic accounting he had ever seen in his career. The breadcrumbs I had traced from the stolen affordable housing deposits directly through Preston's shell companies and into DeAndre's offshore gambling accounts had given the federal authorities exactly what they needed. Agent Hayes explained that they had been trying to build a case against the Pierce luxury real estate firm for over 2 years, But Reginald and Preston had always managed to bury their tracks just deep enough to avoid a formal subpoena. My containment script had basically gift-wrapped their entire criminal enterprise. He smiled warmly, congratulating me on the beautiful baby girl before casually mentioning that federal indictments were currently being drafted. The net was officially closing, and Reginald and Preston were entirely oblivious to the federal predators circling their glass house. As Agent Hayes departed, thanking me for the hospitality, my cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw an email notification flagged with high importance. The sender was Richard Sterling, the Pierce's expensive attack dog lawyer. I opened the message, reading the incredibly smug legal jargon with a sense of mild amusement. The email was a formal demand disguised as a legal threat. It stated that the annual Pierce Luxury Real Estate shareholder meeting was scheduled for the following morning at 10 o'clock. Sterling pompously informed me that he had secured an emergency judicial injunction and that I was legally required to attend the meeting in person. The injunction supposedly mandated that I stand before the board of directors and manually input the decryption keys to release their corporate servers, restoring their access to their stolen wealth. Sterling ended the email by suggesting that my failure to appear would result in immediate arrest for contempt of court and would be used as definitive proof in their custody battle to have my daughter permanently removed from my care. They actually thought they had checkmated me. Reginald and Preston were planning an elaborate public execution. They wanted me to walk into their beautiful 30-story commercial high-rise, the same building I secretly owned, and force me to submit to their authority in front of all their wealthy shareholders. They wanted to humiliate the girl from the South Side, forcing me to bow down and hand over the keys to their empire so they could maintain the illusion of their supremacy. They honestly believed a piece of paper signed by a friendly local judge would somehow overwrite the absolute digital control I possessed. I read the email a second time, shaking my head at the sheer, staggering magnitude of their arrogance. They were so busy trying to destroy me that they had completely failed to check their own commercial lease agreements. They had no idea that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was already auditing their ledgers. And they certainly had no idea that their landlord was the very woman they were trying to evict from her own life. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I walked across the sunlit patio, taking my beautiful daughter back into my arms. She cooed softly, staring up at me with bright, innocent eyes that looked nothing like her cowardly father. I kissed her soft forehead, holding her close as the final pieces of my endgame clicked flawlessly into place. I smiled down at my baby, feeling a fierce protective warmth radiate through my chest. "Get your cute dress on, little one," I whispered softly, swaying her in the warm afternoon breeze. "We are going to a board meeting." I handed my sweet sleeping daughter over to my trusted private nanny, who had already prepared the baby bag for a quiet afternoon in the nursery. I kissed her soft, warm cheek one last time before turning my attention entirely to the war waiting for me downtown. The drive into the heart of the city was a quiet blur of towering glass structures and the steady hum of Atlanta morning traffic. Sitting in the plush leather seat of my private town car, I felt an absolute chilling sense of calm settle deep into my bones. For years, the Pierce family had gone out of their way to make me feel small, inadequate, and entirely unwelcome in their pristine, privileged world. They had weaponized their wealth against me, using their bank accounts and their social standing to remind me that I was just a girl from the South Side who had married above her station. Today, I was going to remind them that wealth is temporary, but brilliance is a weapon that can never be repossessed. I was dressed for a corporate execution. My custom-tailored ivory pantsuit draped perfectly over my frame, projecting an aura of absolute uncompromising authority and quiet, devastating wealth. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, flawless bun, and my makeup was sharp and precise. I did not look like the exhausted, terrified new mother DeAndre had tried to manipulate just hours earlier. I looked like the apex predator I had truly become. When my town car pulled up to the gleaming glass facade of the commercial high-rise, the Onyx Holdings building my legal team was already waiting for me in the massive marble lobby. Three of the most feared and expensive corporate litigators in the Southeast stood together, forming a silent wall of dark suits and leather briefcases. My lead attorney, Harrison, offered me a brief, respectful nod as I approached. There were no nervous questions or last-minute strategy discussions. We knew exactly what we were here to do. We stepped into the private executive elevator, and the silent high-speed ascent to the penthouse level felt like a countdown to an explosion. When the elevator doors slid silently open, we stepped out onto the plush carpet of the Pierce Luxury Real Estate corporate headquarters. The receptionist behind the massive curved desk looked up, her eyes widening in immediate panic when she recognized me, flanked by a team of severe-looking lawyers. She reached for her phone to call security, but Harrison simply flashed a court document and shook his head silently, ordering her to put the receiver down. She swallowed hard and sat back in her chair, watching with wide, terrified eyes as we marched directly down the main corridor toward the executive boardroom. Through the floor-to-ceiling frosted glass walls of the boardroom, I could see the entire pathetic spectacle unfolding. Reginald was sitting at the head of the massive custom-built mahogany table, looking every bit the arrogant king presiding over his loyal court. Vivian sat rigidly to his right, her hair perfectly coiffed and her neck heavy with diamonds that were undoubtedly purchased with embezzled funds. DeAndre was slouched in a thick leather chair, looking completely out of place. He was pale, sweating profusely, and jittery, rubbing his hands together nervously after clearly spending the night in a federal holding cell. Ebony was sitting near the back, aggressively typing on her phone and completely ignoring the room. Sitting around the rest of the table were the affluent Black shareholders of the company, wealthy investors, and prominent community leaders who had trusted the Pierce family with their millions. Preston was standing confidently at the front of the room, holding a remote clicker and gesturing toward a massive digital screen displaying slick, colorful PowerPoint slides of fabricated revenue graphs and projected growth charts. He was lying through his teeth to the very people he was actively robbing blind. I did not knock. I simply pushed open the heavy double-glass doors and let them slam against the wall. The sharp, heavy click of my heels echoed like gunshots against the polished hardwood floor of the boardroom. My legal team fanned out seamlessly behind me, sealing off the exit and projecting a terrifying wall of corporate intimidation. The arrogant chatter and Preston's smooth sales pitch died instantly, sucked out of the room and replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. Preston froze mid-sentence, his arm still raised toward the screen, his laser pointer hovering over a completely fabricated profit margin. Reginald shot up from his leather chair, his face instantly turning a violent shade of mottled purple. "What is the meaning of this?" he bellowed, his deep, booming voice bouncing off the acoustic panels of the glass walls. "Security, get security up here right now. This woman is a hostile cyber terrorist. She has no right to be in this building. She is trespassing." Vivian clutched her pearl necklace, letting out a loud, dramatic gasp, while Ebony finally looked up from her phone, her mouth dropping open in shock. DeAndre physically shrank back into his expensive leather seat, pulling his shoulders inward and refusing to make eye contact with me. He looked exactly like the terrified, cowardly little boy he truly was. I did not flinch at Reginald's booming threats. I walked slowly and deliberately to the opposite end of the long mahogany table, stopping right in the center of the room. I maintained unbroken deadpan eye contact with Reginald, letting him yell until his chest heaved. The wealthy shareholders shifted uncomfortably in their seats, murmuring to one another in confusion as they watched the spectacle unfold. They were prominent, respected figures in the Atlanta business community, people who prided themselves on integrity, excellence, and decorum, and they were currently watching the great patriarch of the Pierce family completely lose his composure over the presence of one silent woman. Harrison stepped forward, unbuttoning his suit jacket with a calm, practiced efficiency. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute, devastating authority in his tone immediately commanded the entire room. He pulled a thick, legally bound document from his leather briefcase and slapped it down onto the center of the polished table. The sharp, loud smack made DeAndre physically jump in his seat. Mr. Pierce Harrison said calmly, addressing Reginald while ignoring the furious shouting. My client, Miss Washington, is here today in her official capacity as the sole owner and managing director of Onyx Holdings, LLC. As you and your chief financial officer are well aware, Onyx Holdings is the legal owner of this commercial high-rise. We are officially serving you with immediate notice of lease termination and commercial eviction. Reginald let out a loud, scoffing laugh, looking around at the confused shareholders as if seeking their validation and support. This is absolutely absurd, he spat, pointing a thick, trembling finger at Harrison. Pierce Luxury Real Estate has leased this penthouse for over a decade. Our corporate rent is paid in full every single month. You cannot simply walk in here and evict a multi-million-dollar corporation on a whim just because my bitter, mentally unstable daughter-in-law is throwing a temper tantrum. Actually, Mr. Pierce, your rent has not been paid in over 6 months, Harrison replied, his voice smooth as glass, as he flipped open the heavy folder to reveal a thick stack of highlighted banking statements and routing numbers. Your chief financial officer has been systematically diverting the monthly lease payments into a series of offshore shell accounts. Under the standard breach of contract clause for severe financial delinquency and proven criminal embezzlement, Onyx Holdings has the absolute legal right to terminate this lease, effective immediately. You and your entire staff have exactly 1 hour to vacate Mrs. Washington's property before we have the local authorities forcefully remove you for trespassing. The entire boardroom erupted into absolute deafening chaos. The wealthy shareholders began speaking all at once, demanding immediate answers from Reginald and Preston, their voices overlapping in a crescendo of panic and outrage. Vivian's jaw dropped open in pure horror as she slowly turned her head to look at her favorite son, Preston. Ebony dropped her phone onto the table, the screen cracking against the wood. DeAndre buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic whimpering sound as he realized the total destruction of their fake empire was now entirely public. Reginald gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned stark white, his eyes bulging as he stared down at the undeniable financial documents proving that his own son had been stealing from the family company. Preston completely snapped. The meticulously crafted corporate facade, the expensive suits, the smooth-talking charm, and the unearned generational arrogance he had maintained for years shattered into a million jagged, pathetic pieces right there in front of the board. He realized in a split second that he was completely trapped. The federal investigators already had his digital ledgers. His own father was looking at him with pure murderous disbelief, and the wealthy investors he had spent years kissing up to were currently watching him be exposed as a common petty thief. The pressure of his total unmasking broke his mind. He slammed his hands down on the presentation podium, his face twisting into an ugly, hideous mask of pure venom and unrestrained rage. He looked directly at me, his eyes wild, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. "You think you are so smart! You little Southside trash!" he screamed, his voice cracking with absolute hysteria, the sound echoing violently through the glass room. "You think wearing a nice, tailored suit and hiding behind expensive lawyers changes what you actually are? You are nothing but a ghetto gold digger who got lucky. You do not belong in this building, Jamila. You do not belong in this boardroom. You do not belong in our world." The entire room froze. The affluent black shareholders, men and women who had fought tooth and nail against systemic prejudice, institutional racism, and overwhelming odds to build their own legitimate wealth, stared at Preston with absolute silent disgust. Preston was so blinded by his own privilege and his deep-seated, ingrained hatred for anyone he deemed beneath his social class that he had completely forgotten who his audience was. He was standing in a room full of self-made, highly educated black millionaires hurling vicious classist and racist microaggressions at a brilliant black woman who had just legally outsmarted his entire corrupt family. "You are a charity case," Jamila Preston continued to rant, spit literally flying from his trembling lips as he completely unraveled, throwing away every ounce of his professional dignity. My brother took pity on you because you had nothing. We let you sit at our dinner table. We gave you a taste of real money, and this is how you repay us. You steal our corporate servers, you hack our private accounts, and you think you can just buy us out like we are nothing. You will always be the poor little charity case from the projects. You will never be one of us, no matter how many fake holding companies you invent or how much money you steal. I let the heavy, shocking silence stretch out after his pathetic, unhinged tirade. I let every single hateful, bitter word hang in the cold air, allowing the shareholders to fully digest the sheer toxic arrogance and moral bankruptcy of the Pierce family. I did not yell back. I did not cross my arms or act defensive. I did not need to lower myself to his desperate level. I simply stood at the end of my mahogany table, adjusted the cuffs of my tailored ivory suit, and looked at Preston with nothing but cold clinical pity. I believe Harrison said, his voice slicing through the heavy silence like a razor blade, that Mrs. Washington has made herself perfectly clear. Your lease is terminated, your assets are frozen, and based on the federal agents currently waiting in the lobby to speak with Mr. Preston Pierce regarding wire fraud, your immediate future is going to be incredibly busy. You have 59 minutes to pack your personal belongings and leave my client's building. Preston stood at the front of the room, his chest heaving, and his face a blotchy, sick shade of red, as the last of his hateful words echoed against the frosted glass walls. I did not flinch. I did not lower my gaze. I just let the absolute deafening silence stretch out, allowing it to stretch so long and so tight that the air in the boardroom began to feel heavy and suffocating. The affluent black men and women seated around the massive mahogany table were completely frozen, their eyes fixed on Preston in pure, unadulterated shock. He had just ripped off his own carefully constructed corporate mask. He had just shown these wealthy, proud investors exactly what he thought of black people when they were no longer blindly handing him their money. I walked slowly past my wall of corporate litigators, the soft, measured click of my heels breaking the dead silence of the room. Reginald was trembling violently in his heavy leather chair, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out as he realized the catastrophic public relations nightmare his white son-in-law had just created in front of his most vital financial backers. Vivian looked like she was going to be physically sick, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles were white. I did not spare either of them a single glance. I walked directly to the massive presentation podium, where Preston was still gripping the edges of the wood, his knuckles pale and his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Step aside, Preston," I said, my voice completely level and devoid of any emotion. He stared at me, his eyes wild and bloodshot, but something in my absolute calm terrified him. He took a slow, shaking step back, his hands falling limply to his sides, as if the remaining fight had just drained completely out of his body. I reached into the pocket of my ivory suit jacket and pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. Preston had left his laptop connected to the main boardroom projector system, expecting to continue his fraudulent song and dance. I bypassed his ridiculous PowerPoint presentation with a few quick keystrokes, closing out the fabricated revenue graphs and the fake projected growth charts. The massive digital screen on the far wall went completely black for a split second, causing a ripple of anxious murmurs to pass through the seated shareholders. I inserted my flash drive into the port. The system recognized my administrative override immediately. A new secure folder appeared on the giant screen, illuminating the dark room with a harsh, bright white light. I clicked it open and hundreds of meticulously organized financial documents flooded the display. The shareholders shifted in their leather seats, leaning forward slightly, their brows furrowed as they tried to make sense of the sudden influx of raw data. Reginald finally found his voice, his hands gripping the mahogany table as he tried to push himself up to a standing position. "What are you doing to my screens?" he barked, his voice weak and lacking all of its usual booming authority. "Turn that off right now, Jamila. You are manipulating our systems." I turned to face the long table, resting my hands calmly on the podium. "Gentlemen and ladies," I said, addressing the board of investors directly, completely ignoring Reginald's pathetic sputtering. "What you were just looking at a few moments ago was a carefully curated fairy tale designed by Preston to keep your wallets open and your questions to an absolute minimum. What you are looking at now is the absolute unfiltered truth about where your dividends have actually been going for the past 2 years. I clicked the remote in my hand, and a complex web of financial ledgers appeared on the screen. I had spent hours highlighting the specific fraudulent transactions in bright, unforgiving red so there could be no confusion. I explained clearly and methodically how Pierce Luxury Real Estate had been systematically targeting affordable housing projects on the south side of Atlanta. I showed them how Reginald and Preston were taking massive earnest money deposits from vulnerable families and then intentionally defaulting on the construction contracts. I watched the faces of the investors drop as I pulled up the internal corporate communications, proving that the building delays were entirely manufactured. These were community leaders, men and women, who had invested their capital specifically to build up those disadvantaged neighborhoods, and now they were looking at hard digital proof that their money was being used to bleed those same communities completely dry. But that is only half the story. I continued, my voice echoing clearly through the tense, heavy atmosphere of the boardroom. I clicked to the next slide, revealing a dizzying geographical map of offshore shell companies. I explained how Preston, acting as the trusted chief financial officer, had meticulously laundered the stolen deposits and the missing shareholder dividends. I tracked the money live on the screen, showing the exact routing numbers and the time-stamped wire transfers, moving millions of dollars out of the company operating accounts and funneling them directly into a series of anonymous holding companies located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. Reginald stared up at the screen, his face draining of all color until his skin was a sickly ash gray. He turned his head slowly, his neck stiff, to look at Preston. Preston was sweating profusely, shaking his head in rapid denial and taking another step backward toward the frosted glass doors. Reginald had trusted Preston implicitly. He had given the son-in-law the keys to the entire financial kingdom, believing Preston possessed some kind of superior business pedigree. He had marginalized his own son DeAndre, viewing him as a weak liability, and elevated Preston to the absolute top of the corporate hierarchy. And now Reginald was sitting in his own boardroom watching the undeniable digital proof that his golden son-in-law had been robbing him blind the entire time. "But Preston is not a foolish man," I said smoothly, bringing the final piece of the puzzle onto the massive screen. He knew that if the federal authorities ever audited these accounts, he needed a perfect fall guy. He needed someone reckless enough and arrogant enough to take the ultimate blame for the missing millions. I clicked the remote one final time. The offshore shell companies vanished from the screen, replaced by a series of private bank statements. Every single stolen dollar, every missing dividend, every laundered deposit eventually settled into 3 massive central accounts. And the names on those accounts were displayed in massive, bold, black letters. They were registered exclusively under the name DeAndre Pierce. DeAndre let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine from the back of the room. Sinking so low into his leather chair, it looked as though he was trying to physically merge with the floorboards. He had been using the stolen funds to cover massive illegal gambling debts, moving money through underground bookies and offshore casinos, thinking he was utterly untouchable. Preston had used DeAndre's severe gambling addiction as the perfect cover, funneling the embezzled corporate funds through DeAndre's personal vices so that the entire criminal enterprise rested squarely on DeAndre's shoulders. If the feds ever came knocking, the paper trail ended with the biological son, not the son-in-law. The heavy, stunned silence in the boardroom finally shattered into a million pieces. The affluent investors erupted all at once. A wealthy real estate developer from Buckhead slammed his heavy fist down on the mahogany table, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at Reginald. "You stole from us!" the developer shouted, his voice vibrating with absolute fury. "You sat in my home, Reginald. You drank my wine, and you sold me on lifting up our community while you let your son in-law steal my money to pay for your son's gambling addiction." Another investor, a prominent female surgeon, stood up abruptly, pulling her designer coat tightly around her shoulders in sheer disgust. She looked directly at Vivian, who was now quietly sobbing into her manicured hands, her mascara running down her cheeks. "You people are a complete disgrace," the surgeon said, her voice laced with absolute cold contempt. "You are nothing but common thieves wearing expensive suits and pretending to be elite." Ebony was staring at her phone screen, furiously refreshing her banking apps, but the accounts were all frozen solid. She looked up, her face pale with the sudden horrifying realization that her entire luxury lifestyle, her endless shopping sprees, and her meaningless socialite status were completely gone. The money was gone. The reputation was gone. Reginald was completely paralyzed. He could not yell. He could not command the room or order security to remove me. He just sat there, practically glued to his chair, staring up at the massive digital screen, watching his entire legacy, his wealth, his pristine reputation, and his freedom burn to the ground in bright red financial markers. The empire he had built on arrogance and intimidation was completely gone, dismantled piece by piece by the very woman he had called a lower-class charity case just weeks prior. Preston, realizing that the room had turned entirely hostile, tried to make a break for it. He turned toward the frosted glass doors, his eyes darting around like a trapped rat looking for any possible escape route. He thought he could simply slip away in the chaos and catch a flight out of the country before the dust settled. But before his hand could even touch the heavy metal handle of the boardroom door, a new sound pierced the heavy, chaotic atmosphere of the penthouse. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the shouting of the angry shareholders, but it was growing rapidly louder. The sharp, piercing wail of police sirens echoed up from the city streets far below. The sound bounced off the surrounding glass high-rises, multiplying and echoing until the high-pitched scream filled the entire boardroom. The pitch of the sirens abruptly cut off, indicating that multiple vehicles had just pulled up directly in front of the commercial high-rise, the very building my holding company owned. Preston froze, his hand hovering over the door handle, his face a mask of absolute terror. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive elevator, located just down the main marble corridor, let out a sharp, clear ding. The sound cut through the shouting in the boardroom, bringing an instant chilling silence back to the room. Everyone turned their heads to look through the frosted glass walls. Through the blurry transparency of the glass, we could see the silhouettes of several large figures stepping out of the elevator. They were moving with absolute synchronized purpose. They marched down the marble hallway, their heavy boots hitting the polished floor in a steady, terrifying rhythm. As they reached the clear glass sections near the boardroom entrance, the distinct, stark yellow letters spelling FBI were clearly visible, printed across the backs of their dark, heavy windbreakers. They were walking straight toward the glass doors of the boardroom, their badges reflecting the overhead lights. The trap had finally snapped shut, and the Pierce family was entirely out of time. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung inward, pushing Preston backwards so forcefully that he stumbled and nearly tripped over his own expensive leather shoes. Special Agent Marcus Hayes stepped across the threshold, flanked by half a dozen federal agents whose sheer physical presence instantly sucked whatever remaining oxygen was left in the room. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying efficiency, spreading out along the perimeter of the mahogany table and physically blocking every possible avenue of escape. Their dark windbreakers rustled sharply in the quiet room, the bright yellow federal insignia on their backs, reflecting against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Atlanta skyline. Preston immediately threw his hands up in the air, stepping away from his father-in-law and pointing a trembling finger directly at DeAndre. "I had nothing to do with this," Preston stammered, his voice pitching upward in a shrill panic that completely destroyed his carefully cultivated corporate persona. "The accounts are in DeAndre's name. You can check the ledgers yourselves. All the offshore accounts belong to him. He is the one with the gambling problem. I just tried to manage the fallout to protect the shareholders." DeAndre looked at Preston with absolute horror, realizing in a fraction of a second that the man he had looked up to, the man who was supposed to be his brilliant financial mentor, had explicitly set him up to take the fall for the entire criminal operation. "You set me up!" DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking as tears began to stream down his face. You told me those papers were just tax write-offs. You said you were handling it. You promised me you had a system. Reginald tried to intervene, trying desperately to salvage whatever shred of patriarchal authority he had left. He puffed out his chest and took a heavy step toward Agent Hayes, demanding to speak with his attorney, Richard Sterling, immediately. He tried to use his booming voice to intimidate the federal agents, but the sound was hollow and weak. Hayes did not even blink. He simply pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and informed Reginald that Mr. Sterling was currently detained in the lobby, downstairs being served with his own federal subpoena for conspiring to hide corporate assets. Reginald Pierce, Preston Davis, and DeAndre Pierce. Agent Hayes announced, his voice projecting across the room, calm and completely devoid of any sympathy. We have federal warrants for your immediate arrest on multiple counts of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the boardroom sounded like the final definitive slamming of a vault door. Reginald's entire identity had been built on intimidation and perceived invincibility. But watching him be physically restrained and pushed against the frosted glass of his own conference room was a pathetic sight. His knees buckled slightly, and an agent had to grip his expensive suit jacket to keep him upright. The great patriarch of the Pierce family, the man who had treated me like disposable trash for years, was suddenly reduced to a trembling old man facing the absolute destruction of his legacy. Preston was sobbing openly now, begging the agents to let him call his personal lawyer, claiming he could provide them with even more evidence against Reginald if they just offered him a plea deal. The speed with which he turned on the family that had embraced him was staggering, but completely expected. He was a parasite who had fed off their arrogance, and now that the host was dying, he was desperately trying to save his own skin. In the back of the room, Ebony sat completely frozen in her chair. The sister-in-law who had made a sport out of mocking my clothes, my Southside background, and my lack of generational wealth, was suddenly confronted with her own absolute poverty. She was staring blankly at her dead cell phone, her mouth slightly open as she realized that her trust fund was frozen, her credit cards were bouncing, and her entire socialite status had just evaporated into thin air. She had never worked a day in her life, and now the stolen money that funded her endless shopping sprees and luxury vacations was locked away in a federal evidence vault. The affluent black shareholders, the men and women who had watched this entire spectacle unfold, recognized a sinking ship when they saw one. They quietly gathered their belongings, zipping up their leather briefcases and pulling on their coats. They did not offer any words of comfort to Reginald. They did not look at Preston or DeAndre. Instead, as they filed out of the boardroom, several of them stopped briefly by my side. One prominent real estate developer offered me a firm, respectful nod quietly, thanking me for exposing the rot before it could drag the rest of their investments down with it. They looked at me not as a charity case or a bitter ex-wife, but as a formidable corporate equal who had just executed a flawless hostile takeover. As the room began to empty, leaving only my legal team, the federal agents, and the shattered remains of the Pierce family, Vivian finally broke. The matriarch, who had prided herself on appearances on country club etiquette and the illusion of superiority, watched her entire world collapse in the span of 5 minutes. She watched the federal agents pat down her husband, removing his expensive watch and his silk tie. She watched her golden son-in-law crying like a child, and her biological son completely paralyzed with fear. She turned her head and saw me standing perfectly calm at the head of the mahogany table, adjusting the cuffs of my ivory suit. The contrast between my absolute composure and her total destruction pushed her over the edge. Vivian rushed across the room, her designer heels slipping slightly on the polished floor. She reached out and grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging desperately into the fabric of my sleeve. Her face was a mess of running mascara and streaked foundation, her eyes wide and bloodshot with absolute terror. "Please, Jamila," she sobbed, her voice breaking as she clung to me, pulling at my arm with a pathetic kind of desperate strength. Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it is a mistake. You cannot let them take him away. He is your daughter's father, Jamila. Please, she needs her paternal family. You cannot let her grow up knowing her father is in prison. I looked down at the woman who had made my life a living nightmare. I remembered the cold, calculating way she had treated me when I first entered their home. I remembered how she had belittled my background, how she had sneered at my career, and how she had actively encouraged DeAndre to hide his assets and leave me with nothing. I remembered the sheer cruelty in her eyes when she told me that the women in her family did not need help doing anything. I did not raise my voice. I did not pull away violently. I simply reached over and smoothly peeled her trembling fingers off my jacket, letting her hand drop uselessly to her side. I maintained unbroken eye contact with her, allowing the cold, clinical reality of the situation to wash over her completely. You said the women in this family deliver on their own. Vivian, I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet space between us. You were right. My daughter does not need a family of federal inmates. She has me, and I am more than enough. Vivian let out a sharp, devastated gasp, stumbling backward, as if I had physically struck her. She covered her mouth with her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs as the absolute finality of my words sank in. There would be no mercy. There would be no family loyalty. The bridge had been burned long ago, and she was the one who had handed me the matches. Hearing his mother's sobs, DeAndre finally broke through his paralysis. He pulled away from the federal agent who was holding his arm and dropped heavily to his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor. His expensive tailored pants wrinkled around his calves as he looked up at me, his face slick with sweat and tears. He looked so small, so utterly pathetic, kneeling in the ruins of the empire he had helped destroy. Jamila, please. He begged, his voice a wet, pathetic whine that made my skin crawl. I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything I did. I love you, Jamila. I always loved you. Please do not do this to me. I cannot go to prison. I will not survive in there. Please save me, Jamila. You are the only one who can fix this. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever papers you need, just please do not let them take me away. He reached out his hands, restricted by the heavy steel handcuffs, trying to grab the hem of my pantsuit. I looked down at the man I had once thought I would spend the rest of my life with. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left, no sadness, no lingering betrayal. He was just a stranger, a cowardly, selfish stranger who had tried to break me and failed spectacularly. I did not answer him. I simply stepped over his kneeling, trembling form as if he was nothing more than a piece of garbage left on the floor. Harrison and my legal team seamlessly fell into step behind me, forming a protective wedge as I walked away from the chaos. The sound of the federal agents reading the final Miranda rights and the pathetic, frantic sobbing of the Pierce family faded into background noise as I pushed through the frosted glass doors and stepped out into the quiet, sunlit marble corridor. I walked steadily toward the private executive elevators, my heels clicking in a rhythmic, triumphant beat. The air out here felt different, cleaner somehow. I pressed the call button and watched the digital numbers count down. The doors slid silently open, and I stepped inside, turning around just in time to see Agent Hayes marching Preston and Reginald out of the boardroom, their heads bowed, their wrists bound, and their futures completely erased. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing off the penthouse and beginning the smooth, quiet descent down to the lobby. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting out a long, slow exhale. The tension that had been coiled in my shoulders for the past 2 years finally unspooled, completely dissipating into the cool, conditioned air of the elevator car. I had not just survived the fire they tried to throw me into. I had controlled the flames and burned their entire glass house right down to the foundation. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, checking the time. My private nanny had sent me a picture just a few minutes ago. My daughter was fast asleep, resting peacefully in her crib, surrounded by warmth and safety. She would never know the sting of Vivian's insults. She would never have to navigate Reginald's toxic arrogance. She would never be subjected to the cowardly weakness of her father. She would grow up knowing that her mother was a force of nature, a woman who could not be broken, bought, or intimidated. When the elevator reached the ground floor, I stepped out into the massive gleaming lobby of the building I now completely owned. The security guards nodded respectfully as I passed, holding the heavy glass doors open for me. I stepped out onto the sunlit Atlanta streets, taking a deep breath of the warm southern air. The city was alive, moving and bustling with endless possibility. My town car was waiting at the curb, the engine purring softly. The driver opened the back door for me, offering a polite smile. I slid into the plush leather seat, settling back against the cushions as the car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the flow of traffic. I looked out the tinted window, watching the Onyx Holdings building shrink in the distance, a towering monument to my absolute victory. The past was officially dead and buried. The Pierce family legacy was nothing more than a cautionary tale written in federal indictments and seized assets. I unlocked my phone, tapping on the picture of my sleeping baby girl. A soft, genuine smile touched my lips as I looked at her perfect, innocent face. We had a new empire to build, and for the first time in my life, the foundation was entirely mine. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive elevator slid shut behind me, sealing away the frantic chaos of the penthouse. But my lawyers and I did not even make it to the lobby before the final, pathetic act of the Pierce family tragedy played out. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not afford Reginald Preston or DeAndre the quiet, dignified exit they had so desperately pleaded for. Agent Hayes was a man who played strictly by the book, and the book dictated a standard perp walk right out of the front glass doors of the Onyx Holdings building into the glaring midday Atlanta sun. The ensuing months were a relentless media circus and a swift, brutal legal execution. The federal prosecutors did not even need to dig deep into their files because the forensic digital ledgers I had provided mapped out their entire criminal network with flawless, undeniable precision. News vans swarmed the federal courthouse every single day, broadcasting the spectacular downfall of Atlanta's most prominent real estate dynasty. Faced with decades in federal prison, Preston immediately turned on Reginald and DeAndre, hoping to negotiate a lighter sentence. He sang like a canary, detailing exactly how Reginald had authorized the theft of the affordable housing deposits and how DeAndre had laundered the cash to cover his massive illegal sports betting debts. But Preston's cowardly betrayal did not save him. The judge presiding over the case was entirely unsympathetic to their brand of white-collar greed, particularly because they had preyed on vulnerable lower-income families to line their own silk pockets. The sentencing hearing was a swift, merciless affair. Preston and DeAndre were both sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole for wire fraud, embezzlement, and severe money laundering. Reginald, due to his advanced age and suddenly failing health, managed to secure an 8-year sentence, but his punishment extended far beyond the cold concrete walls of a federal cell. The federal government moved with devastating speed to seize absolutely everything. They froze his offshore accounts, liquidated his diverse stock portfolios, and stripped him of his commercial real estate license permanently. The great Reginald Pierce, the man who had demanded I surrender my own company to him, was officially a convicted felon and a bankrupt disgrace whose name became a toxic punchline in the affluent Atlanta business community. The Pierce luxury real estate firm was completely dissolved, its assets auctioned off to pay restitution to the hundreds of families they had defrauded. But the most profound poetic justice was reserved for the women who had made it their daily mission to remind me of my South Side roots. With the men locked away and the federal government aggressively seizing all